Moving on to section C, so the 25 mark questions. Let's get started with number 7, and of course in the exam you only pick one of these two 25 mark questions. But for practice sake we're going to attempt both, but let's get started with number 7. So evaluate the likely effects, so it's an effects question, of an increase in protectionism. Straight away, this is a very, very good question. If you revise your content well, this should be a very accessible question. But evaluate the likely effects of an increase in protectionism on an economy, on the economy of a developing country of your choice. Okay, so straight away here, firstly, great question, especially if you know your content eligible globalization. And then the last bit of the question, of a developing country of your choice. So as you know, having real world fact files, having real country fact files is always emphasized a lot by teachers and by examiners for questions like this. And this is why, especially throughout the year, I emphasise real world application, and especially for paper 2 for your macroeconomics, having a few country fact files is invaluable. As now, for this question, and it's just standard for all of these 25 mark questions, even in micro, if they tell you to refer to a specific industry, like for example, you might refer to the banking industry, the motor industry, but here they told you to refer to a specific developing country. If you do not refer explicitly to a developing country, you'll be limited to level 4, which of course is going to limit your marks. So therefore you need to have a decent fact file, a decent amount of knowledge on the real world. So now let's attempt the question. So an increase in protectionism. So basically, what are the effects of an increase in protectionism, and what are some things that we actually call an increase in protectionism? So things like classic one is obviously tariffs. Then we have things like quotas. We have subsidies to like domestic producers for infant industries, and there's some non-tariff barriers as well. But these are the main things that we call an increase in protectionism. Now, the topic of protectionism, globalization as a whole, is characterized by one diagram. There is one main diagram in this entire topic, and of course it is a tariff diagram. And the question is quite literally asking you effects of an increase in protectionism. So the tariff diagram is going to be very valuable here to just build that chain of analysis. And let's draw this out here. So nice and big. Of course, so the tariff diagram is quite simple, just price and quantity on your axes. And then it is just literally a simple supply and demand diagram. But since we're talking about tariffs and the global economy, it's supply but is domestic supply in this scenario. And then same for demand, it's demand but domestic demand. Now, a lot of students know how to draw a tariff diagram, but they don't actually understand the diagram itself. This is why when you get questions which are slightly unique, where they might not ask you specifically on protectionism. So this is quite an easy question, I would say, an increase in protectionism. But they might ask you a question, something like a closed economy. That is when having a deeper understanding of these diagrams, and this is why, especially in my live classes, I emphasise diagram understanding, and I really break down the nitty-gritty of the diagrams, since if you have that understanding, it means that chain of analysis is so much more elevated, and in your exam, if you get thrown a bit of a spanner of a question, you are still very well prepared, since you actually fully understand the diagram. But so what does this point represent? This is where supply domestic intersects demand domestic. And what does it mean by domestic? So for example, if we're talking about the UK, this is where the UK's suppliers meet the UK's consumer demand. So this point here is almost before globalization. So before countries started trading with each other, and we call this point here a closed economy. Why is this called closed economy? Since at this point, the domestic demand, so the demand by the UK consumers, is met perfectly by the supply of domestic by UK firms. That means there is no need to import goods from foreign countries. And this is what happened before globalization. There's a massive disadvantage of globalization we speak about, which is that countries have become reliant on other countries. But if you think about before globalization, every country to a certain degree was self-sufficient because they knew they couldn't import anything, so they would have to make every single thing they need themselves. Thus, this is shown by a country's demand being completely met by domestic supply. So this was before globalization occurred. Then what happened when globalization occurred? So let's go through the reasons why globalization occurred. So there's several reasons, like containerization, improvements in technology. It basically meant overall countries started trading with each other more. And this is why the theory for this topic, you need to be very strong on it. But it all links back to the comparative advantage. So every country had a comparative advantage. So for example, a lot of African countries had comparative advantages in natural resources. China had a comparative advantage in manufacturing goods. Saudi Arabia had a comparative advantage in oil. But basically all that meant, comprehensively, it meant that the countries that had a comparative advantage in these goods could produce it for a lower cost. So if everyone was trading and every country had a comparative advantage, it overall basically meant that costs decreased massively. Since a country which had the comparative advantage would produce that good, meaning that everyone was getting goods for cheaper. So what happened? So we saw prices drop from a closed economy from PE to now P1. For example, the UK doesn't have a lot of oil, and if we try to extract our oil, we'd have to dedicate several factors of production towards it. It would be very inefficient and it'd cost us a lot of money. But if Saudi Arabia had to extract oil, since they already have the factors of production there and they've already made it very efficient, it's really cheap for them. Thus meaning, when we move from being a closed economy, so basically not trading, to when we move to trading, it meant price drop from PE to P1. And what does WS represent? WS represents world supply. So this is what we called after globalization. So when globalization occurred, basically the world used to trade, so we call it world supply now. So now what happens with regards to firms and consumers when world supply comes in, so when globalization kicks in? And let's see what happens. So we have QS here, and then we have, which is, why is this QS? Since this is where the world supply curve intersects the supply curve. And now we have QD here, and why is this QD? Since this is where the world supply curve intersects the demand curve. So now, what does QS and QD represent? QS represents the quantity supplied by domestic producers at price P1. So this is how much domestic producers want to supply at this low price of P1. And the reason why this price is so low at P1 is that these global markets have global firms on them which are specialized in certain goods, have the comparative advantage, very efficient, so can produce at very low prices. But as we can see, at these low prices, the UK firms do not want to supply lots since they don't have much incentive at such low prices to supply lots. But as we can see, at these low prices, these UK firms, these UK producers have very little incentive to supply since the price is so low. But then, on the flip side of the coin, on the consumer side of things, look at what's happening. We have QD, which is at this low price, the quantity demanded by consumers is increased. So when we were at a closed economy before globalization, we can say demand was at QE, and it's actually an extension in demand from QE to QD. And let's very simply think about why this has occurred. This has occurred since, let's think about the law of demand. If you just simply look at a demand curve, what is the main thing we say happens on a demand curve? As price increases, what happens to quantity demanded? Quantity demanded falls. So that is the law of demand. There's an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. And in this scenario here, the price has decreased massively as consumers are willing and able to purchase more at these lower prices. But now we have a bit of a predicament. Quantity demanded is here, which is how much UK consumers want, whereas quantity supplied is here, which is how much UK suppliers want to make, which means there's a massive gap between these where consumer demand isn't being met since UK suppliers do not want to supply at this low price. So now what happens to this entire gap? This is where globalization comes in, and this entire arrow, this entire gap is the quantity imported. So since UK firms do not want to produce QD at P1, what ends up happening is that the quantity just imported, that gap between QS and QD is just imported from foreign countries foreign firms who are willing to produce at this lower price of P1. So what's happening so far? So when we move from a closed economy to now globalization occurring, what has happened? Prices have decreased from PE to P1 and consumers are getting a much lower price. But now domestic producer quantity supplied has decreased from QE to now QS, since domestic producers do not want to supply or do not have incentive to supply at this low price of P1, thus meaning a lot of them may go out of business because quantity imported is too cheap, for example. And this of course links to several parts of the spec like the current account and then of course it links to protectionism. What is a massive reason why that like for example with US tariffs, which have been happening recently, what is a massive reason that presidents set up protectionist policies like tariffs is to protect the domestic industries. Why? Since if all this quantity is imported, it means that, like we said, when we were a closed economy, so when we weren't trading with individuals, domestic firms were producing QE. That is how much they were producing. But now, with free trade, it means that our domestic producers are only producing QS, which means basically lots of firms have gone out of business, lots of employees are no longer employed, since instead of making the good in our own country, we're just importing it. And what does that actually mean? It means that we're just supporting other countries and just neglecting our own country. And that's of course going to lead to massive negative effects, like living standards are going to decrease massively due to a decrease in GDP, since it's not firms operating, and massive knock-on negative effect. But now let's show protectionism. So countries do not want their suppliers going out of business. They want to keep their domestic employment high. So what do? They set up protectionist policies, and one of the main ones we show on this diagram is a tariff. So what does a tariff do? A tariff is going to shift the world supply vertically upwards from world supply to now world supply plus tariff. So let's see the effects of this tariff. So of course the main thing is prices increased from P1 to P2, because what is a tariff? It's a tax on imports usually, so it's going to increase the price of imports. And now let's see how it's affected our quantities. So now quantity supplied has now moved to QS1, and then quantity demanded has now moved to QD1. This will now therefore lead to the quantity imported now is this smaller arrow between QDS and QD1. And this is exactly why we call these tariffs, quota subsidies, we call them protectionist policies. Why are they called protectionist policies? They're protecting our domestic economy. As by putting a tariff on imports, by increasing the price of imports from P1, which is normal, just this is free trade when we're just freely trading with different economies. By putting a tariff on imports, by increasing the price of imports, it increases prices, the prices from P1 to P2. And why does that benefit our own domestic economy? So why does that benefit the UK? Since what happens? Now, quantity supplied goes from, for domestic producers, it goes from QS to QS1. So it increases slightly. And why is that? Since there's a higher price now, there's more incentive for these domestic supplies to supply. There's more incentive for these domestic supplies to produce. And on the flip side of the coin, since prices have gone up, like we said, there's an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. When prices go up, quantity demanded falls, and that's what we see by consumers. So quantity demanded decreases from QD to QD1, thus meaning that gap, that discrepancy between consumers demanding and firms supplying has now decreased, meaning that the number of imports in the country is decreasing. And if the number of imports are decreasing, it means consumers are substituting, and this is the most important line. If the numbers of imports are decreasing, it means consumers are substituting away from buying foreign goods to domestic goods. And if you're buying domestic goods, if you're buying UK goods, you're supporting UK firms. If you're supporting UK firms, you're keeping UK domestic employment high. Since if firms are doing well, if firms are making profits, it means they'll keep on employing workers. And to keep on employing workers, of course, that leads to the main things that the UK cares, the government cares about, which is living standards stay fine, tax revenue stay fine, etc, etc. Okay, so now back to the question. If we think about the effects of an increase in protectionism, and we're going to use the example of tariffs, of course, for this paragraph, some of the negative effects, very simply, is when we introduce a tariff, it's going to lead to a loss in consumer welfare, or whatever you want to call consumer welfare / surplus. Why? What's the main reason for that? Higher prices. And of course, quote the diagram from P1 to P2, and we can actually see this on this diagram. As you can see, I've labelled it up. These gaps to mean, I'm not going to teach you what each gap means, but and from B, so B and D both show the loss in consumer welfare. And these higher prices are represented on the diagram by consumer welfare loss, consumer surplus loss at B and D. So this little triangle here and this little triangle here. And then on the flip side of things, you have the positives, which are, of course, who are the two shareholders in the economy is going to positive effect. First one is going to be producers, of course. Producer surplus increases. Why? Since now, of course, consumers are substituting away from importing goods to now buying domestic goods, meaning that consumer surplus is increasing, and we can see that at point A on the diagram. So this little, I don't know what you call that shape, trapezium, is the producer surplus increasing. And then of course tax revenue, since what is a tariff? A tariff is a tax on imports, and you can see tax revenue by the C rectangle there. And that's pretty much that is the main effects of this of the protectionist policy of tariffs, and that is pretty much how I'd structure my paragraph. Of course, at the start where I was talking about closed economy, that's more for your theory and understanding, but if you can make it relevant, you can hint that in, it's also very good. But this will be how my main paragraph is focused, breaking down the diagram, explaining the diagram, explaining an increase in protectionism using the diagram, and just basically implementing the diagram as much as possible. Now, I've just been explaining the theory, but if I was writing the answer, I would also make sure to include an example of a country. Here, I would just probably picked somewhere. Anyway, you know, India is a good example. India has very high tariffs on electronics manufacturing, so importing phones, importing TVs. I think they have about a 20% tariff. So whenever I was talking about something like so when I move from WS to WS plus tariff, I'd say, for example, India has a 20% tariff. The reason for that, they have a massive initiative which is make it in India, or basically self-sufficiency in India, that they want to be self-sufficient. And what is the reason for that? They want to protect the domestic economy, all the reasons we talked about earlier. They want to make sure the domestic economy is protected, the domestic firms are protected. Why? Because that means domestic employment is protected, which means things like living standards and all the good stuff are protected. Okay, so now moving on to evaluation for this paragraph. There's absolutely, I'd say, tens or hundreds of evaluation points for protectionism. A really good one here, I believe, is, since we're talking specifically about tariffs and protectionism, the extent of protectionism. And what I mean by this is, if you just look at the diagram again, and this is where in your evaluation you can, for example, if you really want to, you draw this diagram again and show this point, you could just draw it on your original diagram. You could draw something like this. And then your evaluation is, however, this depends on the extent of protectionism, as it depends on where the government sets the tariff. As if the tariff is set up here, it has much larger, much amplified effects of those protectionism. There's a much larger loss in consumer surplus. There's a much larger gain of that producer surplus. There's a much larger gain in tax revenue, for example. But there's much more negative effects. So basically, the evaluation point is stating it depends where the government also sets the tariff. As the tariff is massive, if the extent of protectionism is massive, it means we move a lot closer to that point of a closed economy, which has massive risks. It risks inefficiency, isolation, and maybe with this high of tariffs on imports, it could risk retaliation by other countries. So it's a really in-depth evaluation point. So depending on the extent of protectionism, and so the effects depend on the extent of protectionism and where the tariff is actually set. And a great example of this, if you want to do a bit more research, is India again. So India is obviously a massive developing economy. It's doing very, very well. And pre-1991 versus post-1991. So basically, pre-1991, India was very protectionism. They implement lots of protectionist policies, but post-1991, they allowed for trade liberalisation, the privatisation, things like that. And it meant that, so post-1991, so basically in the modern day, they adopt a lot more free trade, rather than pre-1991, where there wasn't much free trade, meaning that they were almost a very closed economy. That wasn't, and the biggest thing that's changed between these two times is the FDI. There wasn't much FDI in India, since they were basically discouraging FDI. But then post 1991, they realised it's a better strategy. Let's trade with our global partners. Allow global partners to use like India. So, like for example, BT call centres in India, and it led to a massive surge in India's GDP. And you can reference that in the evaluation point when you talk about the extent of protectionism. You know, India in 1991, where they had very high protectionist policies, and it led to them almost being very close to this closed economy point, leading to very little inflows of things like FDI and very like almost global isolation. Moving on to the second paragraph, so the effects of an increase in protectionism, and yet again this point is very deeply embedded in theory. So I would say it distorts the theory or comparative advantage. Now, when doing my life classes, a massive thing, especially in this topic in globalization, I tried to emphasize to students. So the overarching effect of this, it distorts the theory of comparative advantage, is that it will decrease, ruin, whatever you want to call it, decrease living standards. Now, that sounds very simple, but the UK, most of you will know, have 7 macroeconomic objectives, 7 main macroeconomic objectives, things like 2% plus or minus 1% inflation rate, the current account, the balance of payments on the current account, budget, environmental sustainability. There's lots of them. And yes, they are macroeconomic objectives, but the main overarching objective, the reason why the government tried to pursue those specific objectives is the overarching goal of living standards. Things like low unemployment, stable inflation, they're all just a pathway to allow, and they're just indicators which the government thinks they can use to allow to improve the well-being improve the living standards of the population. So although it's underrated by lots of students, this is a massively important and weighted point, since this is basically the main factor, the main thing every single country is chasing. Well, and they're chasing an increase in living standards, not a decrease in living standards. But let's explain this point. So the theory of comparative advantage states if countries specialise in the goods they have a comparative advantage in and produce those goods, it means every single country almost becomes a little factory, and they become this specialised factory. And if all of them produce that good that they specialised in, it means global output will increase. And in the end, if global output increases, let's think what happens. If countries specialise in the goods they have a comparative advantage in, for example, every country becomes a specialised factory and they just produce that one good or the several goods which they have a comparative advantage in, it means that country's output will increase for that good. And if a country's output increases, what do we say increases? What's another measure of output? GDP, gross domestic product. This means that countries' GDP is going to increase. So now, the theory of comparative advantage states, if countries specialise in goods they have a comparative advantage in and produce those goods, it means global output will increase, and therefore if global output increases, it means global GDP will increase. And what does it mean if global GDP increases? Everyone basically has more money. Every single country has more money. And if every single country has more money, it means that global living standards will increase. And like we said, this is the overarching aim, the overarching goal of all countries, to improve their living standards. But now, let's flip it on the side of the question. By implementing protectionist policies, this is one thing that will distort, it stops the theory of comparative advantage. Thus we can say, by countries setting up protectionist policies, by them implementing things like tariffs and quotas, it will distort the theory of comparative advantage, thus worsen living standards. As one of the main assumptions of the theory of comparative advantage is that there is no trade barriers. And falling living standards also includes things like poverty, because there's going to be massive increases in poverty rates when living standards fall. And if you're actually thinking about the question and developing country of your choice, we saw this massively in India, where in the last evaluation point I was speaking about pre-1991 and post-1991. So pre-1991, India were heavily they were pursuing protectionist policies, whereas post-1991 they liberalised, they introduced free trade. So pre-1991 we saw poverty rates of about 50%. 50% of people were living under the purchasing power parity of $2.50 a day, or whatever it is, of the World Bank's definition of $2.15 a day. So 50% of the population was in poverty pre-1991. Then post-1991, when they stopped protectionist policies, when they stopped stupid things like everything needing to be approved by the government, it was basically a bit of a like non-democracy. But yeah. But then post-1991, now poverty rates in India, according to the World Bank definition of below £2.15 a day at purchasing power parities, it's only 10%. So it really shows, by them pursuing almost a theory of comparative advantage, by allowing the theory of comparative advantage to nurture almost, it meant that living standards improved. And one thing we saw with living standards improved, it was saw a massive reduction in poverty rates. But of course, straight away, just as an evaluation point, what pops into my mind is we say with a theory of comparative advantage that living standards improve, but it depends on the distribution of living standards improving, since in the capital cities, where maybe the goods with comparative advantages are being produced, maybe they'll increase lots there, but then the distribution of living standards, maybe the rural areas will still say very like in poverty, very poor off. There's lots of evaluation points here, like the involvement of the World Trade Organization, the validity of the theory of comparative advantage itself, since it's built up on very naive assumptions like no trade barriers, no transport costs. Can that actually hold valid in the real world? Is it actually realistic to achieve in the real world? Another great evaluation point, the presence of trading blocks. Of course, they totally changes the game with regards to protectionism, as it's free trade inside the trading block. But there's absolutely loads of points to this question with evaluation, with points of paragraphs like, I didn't even mention like domestic industries, so like protecting infant industries. I didn't really mention retaliation much. Things like global supply chains, how it might affect them. So there's loads of different points here, and even evaluation, things like deglobalization with the US tariffs. Lots of different points, long run versus short run effects. Lots of different points, but yeah, that's like a little overview plan of the 25 mark.